We have seen now a whole bunch of stuff to do with the various light types available to us in Lightwave, and so it is now time for us to take a look at global illumination. There's a few little different aspects to working with global illumination and GI. We'll cover them independently, so if you need to do a reference of a certain bit, then you can just skip to the appropriate video rather than having to scroll through to find what it is. In this one, we'll start with just the basics of GI. Now, the first thing about GI that I think is most helpful is to think of it as you would another light type. Just imagine that GI were a kind of light that you could add to the scene, only rather than being a light, it's here on the global illumination panel in the render property. It's as if there's always a GI light available in your scene, it's just not always turned on. To do that, we turn on Enable GI, and you'll see that absolutely nothing happens. Right, what happens with the basics of GI? So, GI will cast light from any existing light in the scene, or should I say any light that is being cast into the scene. So if you've got an actual light, let me add, I don't know, let's make it an area light, shall we? Just make you visible to camera so I can see where you are. Still can't see where you are. Here you are. Oh, there you are. Now we can see you. Okay, so as we can see, this light is casting light into our scene, right? And when we turn on the GI, that light bounces off the lit walls and starts to illuminate the rest of the scene. Obviously, this is what we're used to thinking of GI as, you know, radiosity, bounced light, and so on. One setting that you will not find for GI on the GI panel is the number of bounces. That's on the render panel here. It's the diffuse bounces that you have set here. So if you set one bounce, then the light only bounces once. So in this case, it's going to come from here, it'll hit the wall, bounce once, and hit the rear wall there. As you can see, that's a little bit darker. And also you can see over here on the far left of the screen, it's quite dark. If I turn that up to 2, then we can see that things here are starting to get a little bit brighter because the light bounces up, comes off the light, hits the wall, bounces once, hits this wall, bounces a second time, hits that wall, or comes to this first wall, bounces once, hits the ceiling, bounces a second time, hits this wall, and so on. You go up to 3 bounces, 4, 5, whatever you like. Frankly, in the majority of situations, any more than 3 bounces is utterly wasted. You'll remember, of course, that we have the intensity fall off for the lights here. GI always has intensity fall off, but it's always inverse distance fall off, right? You cannot change it. So that means that the light that has bounced off this wall is getting weaker the further it travels, but also it inherits the colour of the thing it hits. So we'll see if we turn the light down here, so it's pointing, well, pretty much just at the floor. Then our floor is this sort of brown colour, right? And it's quite dark, so if we look at the light that's being cast up onto the walls here, it's just barely visible. It's very, very dark. If I come to the surface editor, I've got the floor here. Let's make it brighter. So all we're really doing is turning up the brightness of the floor colour. Click OK. Then you see that the bounced light is obviously also getting an awful lot brighter. Why? Well, of course, you remember we talked about the light intensity and said how the intensity is multiplied by the colour, or multiplied by the colour intensity. Same thing with the GI. The light that is bouncing off of the floor is however much light has reached the floor, given of course that this area light has fall off, and it's multiplied by that colour intensity, and then it's cast up and it begins to fall off, and so on, right? So there we go. That's the basic idea of how GI works in terms of its intensity. And it's for that reason that really any more than 3 bounces becomes so weak that you can't even see it. Unless you've got like a few objects really close together, like centimetres apart, and the light's going to be bouncing back and forth between them. It's and they're brightly coloured as well. You know, anything beyond 3 is invisible. For the most part, 2 is plenty. You very rarely need more than that. Of course, with the number of bounces, the longer it takes to render. And the thing that we are often looking at in terms of that, in terms of the render time, is like lights, we've got the number of samples that are used. Just as we talked about in the fundamentals, and as we'll explore in more detail when we get on to sampling workflow, we talk about the renderer using a certain number of samples per pixel, and the lights, of course, have a sample setting here. GI is, if we think of it like a light, it also has a sample setting, and that is the rays setting here, which at moment we can see is just set to 1. Let's bring up our light brightness a little bit so as we can see it more plainly. We'll see that this is, of course, giving us fairly noisy illumination over on the back wall and the ceiling here. In order to clean that up, then we want to use more samples. So if we put it up to 4, then you can see that we're starting to get a cleaner, less noisy render in the GI illuminated areas here. Still a little bit grainy even at 4. Obviously we want to go higher and higher to get nice clean GI. Now there is one way that we can help make things cleaner. That's to use the interpolated mode of the global illumination. That comes out a lot cleaner and it renders a lot faster. There are, however, particular peculiarities to what the interpolated mode is all about. Don't worry, we'll come to that in a subsequent video. But one thing that you might notice right off the bat that I just want to cover here is that people sometimes say that the interpolated mode is brighter than the non-interpolated mode, the brute force mode of radiosity. And so, of course, if we just look at what we're getting there from interpolated versus what we're getting here from brute force, then it does indeed seem correct. The interpolated does seem to be brighter than the brute force. But it's actually not. They are the same. The reason for the difference, or the apparent difference, is the fact that the brute force is sampled with these number of rays. You saw there I had the primary and secondary rays, they were turned up. It's not so much that, it's the fact that if you look in the first pass where you've got little points of light and points of dark, the thing is, of course, that each point on this wall, if you think back to the foundations section, each pixel is being sampled at random for one single ray, because of course we're only at one ray, one sample, and so a ray comes out at random and maybe it hits this light bit of the wall, in which case it renders light, but maybe it comes out at random and hits this dark bit of the floor, in which case it renders dark. So you've got to think of this rendered area over here as being a bit like a halftone. You know, like newspaper print, old-fashioned black and white newspaper print, where you only had pure white or pure black dots, and shading was created by spacing the amount of white to the amount of dark, and that gave you scales of grey, or apparent scales of grey when viewed at a distance. Essentially, that's what you've got here. If you turn the rays way up, then oh look, this area is starting to appear brighter again. And the reason for that is because we've got more rays, so each pixel in this area is sending out more rays into the scene, and thus there is more chance that they will hit a lightened area, or a greater chance that a greater number of them will hit a lightened area, and thus you get a more accurate rendering for what the GI reflected light over here really is. So that is the basics of sampling with your GI. You can, of course, also alter the intensity, just like we had the light intensity. This is done as a percentage. So 100%, and we spoke about this briefly, talking in terms of background radiosity in the light intensity video. 100% is basically real, as it were. It's how much light there should be. If we pump this to, I don't know, let's say 300%, shall we? Then effectively it's like turning up the global illumination light, so everything obviously gets brighter, but it is also unrealistically bright. If, for instance, I just come down to the 1 bounce again, then we'll really show this. Let's turn this up to 1000%. No, more, 5000%. Okay, there we go. So what we can see now is that we've got this light, you know, this actual area light, and it's casting light directly onto this wall over here, which is then bouncing off to illuminate the back wall. And what we can see is that the back wall is actually brighter than this wall, which is just bonkers and makes absolutely no sense. Because of course this area light is the only source of light, and so that wall over there should be the most brightly lit part, and all of the rest of it that's having the light bounced onto it should be darker. But no, it's coming out brighter, because obviously we've overamped the GI. So what else do we have? Well, we've got caustics. Nothing in this scene to show it, but we've seen caustics in other videos. If you're wanting to have caustic effects for reflection and refraction, we've seen that you can only have those render with GI, at least real ones. And we saw that we can have them work with interpolated or brute force GI. I'll just deactivate that area light for a minute for the next part, which is sample backdrop. What sample backdrop does is it takes whatever you've got in the backdrop. Of course, we saw the backgrounds video near the beginning. Whatever is in Lightwave's background, Lightwave's backdrop, that of course can be a source of light. It can cast light into the scene, or at least can do so with global illumination. You'll notice that doing this, I'm getting light onto this wall, but it's no longer bouncing back onto this one, right? And we might wonder why, because we can sort of think of these windows much like area lights, so why am I not getting light bouncing back? That is a slight difference in the way the number of bounces works. The number of bounces is really the number of times GI will cast a ray. So because we are now using sample backdrop, we're getting one GI ray come from the background. In the case where we had the area light, we were getting a direct light ray coming from the area light, and then the first GI ray was being bounced off this wall. In this case, without the real light, with sample backdrop on, then the first GI ray is coming from the backdrop. As such, if you're using sample backdrop, then you normally need an additional bounce. If you're not using sample backdrop, if you're using direct light, then you can usually have one bounce fewer. However, as we will see in upcoming videos, there's almost never any reason to use sample backdrop. It seems like something that you want to do fairly often. You've got a backdrop image, an HDR or something that you're either using for an exterior scene that you're wanting to light, or you've got an HDR sky and you've got an interior room and you're wanting light to come through the windows, just as we've got in this sort of a scene. So you're thinking, we'll use the backdrop for that. You pretty much never want to do it. Again, that is something that we'll explore the ins and outs of in further videos. However, on occasions when you are doing it for some reason, who knows what, you've also got this importance sampling for the background. It doesn't make much of a difference in this scene, but when you've got an HDR, especially an HDR that has got some particularly bright light source in it, so I don't know, say the inside of a disco where you've got these reasonably dark area with lots of very bright hot spots, or you've got an outside sunny day where you've just got a nice reasonably bright sky, but then you've got a very super bright point, which is the sun. That can sometimes cause you to get fireflies in a GI render, where you just get these hot pixels, where of course the scattering of the rays, you've got a pixel that just happens to have hit right on the sun, and so it lights up like the sun, super bright, and the pixels next to it don't. So in order for them to catch, you either have to use more rays or turn on importance sampling and give yourself a high importance sampling number. But again, that's something you will rarely use sample backdrop, I promise. Affected by volumetrics, this is something that we'll mention when we look at volumetrics. However, just so as we're sure, in the case when you do have a volumetric object in your scene and it has emission, so it's actually giving off light, then turning on affected by volumetrics will mean that the light from the volumetric is also cast out by GI in order to illuminate things. Most commonly, this would be the sort of thing that you would do if you were doing like, an explosion or a fireball or something with volumetrics, and you were wanting to use that as an actual light source in the scene, then the GI will allow you to do that. I must warn you, it's very slow. It's very slow. Personally, if I could, I would try to fake it with direct lights. You know, not the volumetric itself, but the light coming from the volumetric, I would probably try to fake. If you've got a complex fireball, you know, that's rolling and churning, that might not be so easy to do with fakery. And you might be forced to do it this way to get something that looks really good. But otherwise, many times I might be tempted to try and fake it because this can be slow. Of course, in addition to volumetrics, you can also have luminous geometry. So if you've got geometry that has got, you know, luminosity in its surface, so perhaps if we use, let's take the floor again as our basic example here, shall we? And let's kill the light again. Let's give the floor a slightly different luminous colour than just that boring grey. Let's give it a horrible lime green. There we go. Then when you've got luminous geometry, of course, GI will also cast that light into the scene for us. But as we already mentioned when we were going through the light types and some of the options there, generally it's better to just use the primitive light in place of luminous geometry. It renders quicker, it renders cleaner, and it's basically analogous to, as we'll see later when I was saying about you don't want to use the background radiosity, and we'll see reasons for that later. The geometric light, the primitive light, is more or less analogous to that, rather than using actual luminous geo and letting GI just cast its light out. You're better off using the actual primitive light itself. You'll get cleaner renders faster doing it that way, whether or not you're using GI on top of that. So there we go. That's the basic overview of what global illumination does and how to think of it. As I say, I prefer to think of it as a light type. It's just got a couple of extra options, such as it doesn't have an actual light source itself. It takes light sources from other places, be that the bounce light from a direct light, from luminous geometry, from background, from a luminous volumetric, or what have you. It has a raise setting, which is basically just a sample setting, and additionally it can also bounce around multiple times, and for some strange reason the bounces are over here. And so with that, we'll just tie it all off here, and we shall come back in the next video when we shall look at the interpolated setting and how that works and how we can get a bit more performance out of it, as well as some of the shortcomings that interpolated radiosity has for us.